Christianity and religion generally, Judaism, have often had a difficult time with patriotism. During the Civil War, Lincoln in the White House had a delegation from the Quaker community. The Quakers were anti-slavery, but they were also anti-war. He gave this group an audience and listened to them, and he wrote a very moving letter to the head of the delegation.
Are you concerned about the growing influence of political extremism, hyperpolarization, and misinformation? Well, you're not alone. This is the American Values Coalition podcast, where we explore the root causes of these societal ills and provide you with strategies to counter them. My guest is Stephen Smith. He is a political science professor at Yale University and the author of Reclaiming Patriotism in an Age of Extremes. There's the cover of the book for those watching on video. Stephen Smith, welcome to the AVC podcast.
Yep, it's a pleasure to be joining you here.
So this book was published in 2021, the same year, that we saw J6 happen, folks invade the Capitol. I'm assuming it was written before that happened. So give me an idea of the background behind the book, why it was written, how it came together.
Well, thank you for asking me that, Knapp, and I can spend the rest of our time together telling the story, so I'll give a condensed version of it. I mean, the germ of the book actually went back quite a long ways before its publication. And in fact, thinking about it, I traced the beginnings of the book actually back to 9/11, 2001. I was teaching at the time, as I did over many years, a course called Introduction to Political Philosophy, which covered all the big philosophers from Plato and Aristotle and so on and so on. And there's always an issue of how do you end a class like that? Where do you end it? And after 9/11, I began to think seriously about the question of patriotism. What do we owe our country? And I began, and I wrote a short piece about this, but never considered writing a book about it. I was working on other things, but it kind of began to figure into my class, and the ideas for it began to germinate in doing this. What sort of pushed me over the edge was actually a story I tell in the book, which I love to tell. We were appropriately at a 4th of July party. With some friends, a colleague of mine here at Yale. We're at their house, and I live in suburban New Haven, and with a group of people. And the hostess of the evening asked everyone, it's 4th of July, did we feel patriotic? And I remember the acute sense of, almost palpable sense of discomfort people seemed to feel at that question. Here we were celebrating our national holiday. And when asked if we felt patriotic, people felt uncomfortable with the question. We then, it only lasted a moment. We then read the Declaration of Independence, and then we tucked into our hamburgers and hot dogs, and the event probably would have been totally forgotten, but it stuck with me. And oddly, it became a kind of inspiration to write this book. Why do some, certainly not everybody, why do some people, usually on the left, and I would say my book was directed to liberals, of whom I consider myself one, what is the problem with patriotism that you have? It was something I felt deeply, and why should people run away from it? And that was what occasioned the book and who I was trying to reach out to and to convince why patriotism needs to be reclaimed.
Okay, and how are you defining patriotism?
Well, I don't have any eccentric or particularly, unusual definition of patriotism. Patriotism is love of country. The question is always, what kind of love is that? And how is it expressed? And how does it differ from other kinds of love and loyalty that we have. And much of the book is devoted to examining the extremes. It's called Reclaiming Patriotism in an Age of Extremes. What are the extremes? Trying to defend patriotism from the extremes, which is to
Hmm.
say, a kind of militant nationalism of the right and a kind of equally militant identity politics, which we might call wokeness, or goes political wokeness, or goes under different names on the left. It has to be reclaimed from those extremes, and the book is an attempt to show what I call in the book enlightened patriotism, a decent patriotism, what that would involve.
Yeah, that's interesting. So we here at AVC, we've dealt a lot with the issues of patriotism versus nationalism on the right, but here you're coming at it from the perspective of um, mostly being influenced by what's going on the left.
Right.
And I've noticed that as well from my lefty friends. There is, at the very least, a discomfort with patriotism, if in some cases hostility towards it. But I think some of that is at least is just motivated by this idea that we're talking about things written by folks who own slaves, and there's the genocide of the Native American community and all this bad stuff in our history, and kind of wanting to remove themselves from that. Maybe that's where a lot of the unease is coming from.
Mm-hmm. There's a kind of a lot of wallowing in guilt and grievance and all kinds of sentiments like this. Uh, but any, I would say, particular, I was about to say any society, but I'm not that sure about any society, but certainly any democratic society, I feel requires buy-in from its citizens, a sense of that the society stands for something decent, that it is worth supporting, and that it is not simply a trail of woes as you go along. I mean, this is very different from autocracies, which are simply governed from the top down. It doesn't make much difference what people think in them. But democracies, as every great political theorist, which is my field, of course, going back to Plato and Rousseau and every Machiavelli and Rousseau, Tocqueville, they all understood and wrote about some form of patriotism as required by a self-governing community. And I really do worry about what happens to a society like ours when patriotism becomes either kind of, as we would say, militarized from one side and despised by the other side. This is not a healthy situation.
Is is some of this at least sort of like a classism that's going on from the left? Like, it's just uncool to be patriotic. Like, if you're a sophisticated person, that stuff is just for like folks who watch NASCAR and live in trailer parks and that kind of stuff. Is any of that, you think, part of it?
That I'm sure that's a part of it, and in fact, I don't know if this is what you're drawing on, but I have a long discussion of cool in my book, in the patriotism book, where the idea of coolness, which is kind of above, in some ways, above politics, it's just sense a kind of distance between yourself and society, or distance between yourself and a cause, or something like that, is the mark of being a sophisticated person, or and so on. And I do think there's a class. I agree very much. There is a class element in it. I mean, everybody kind of admires American cool for what it is. We could give many, as I do in the book, give many examples of coolness that we would like. And yet, society requires warmth at some level. It requires a sense of attachment. Patriotism is a form of loyalty, it's a form of love. It exists within a sort of concentric circle of loves and loyalties that start with the family, extend to friends, extend to religious organizations, sports teams, all kinds of things. We live in a ring of loyalties in which our country is one. I mean, it's odd. One of the few times which you see, as we're seeing now, unabashed expressions of patriotism is in international sporting events like the World Cup, and where in many countries where nobody would ever think to express sort of love of country, all of a sudden it comes out when when their soccer team is playing a rival. Uh, it would not be all of a sudden it's cool as it were, and so I think patriotism is part of this. Is part of this ring of loyalty, loves, and loyalties, and exists often uneasily with some of the others. One of the things my book brings out is that patriotism has always been. I mean, it's not new. This is not new. Patriotism has always been a contested virtue. I mean, that goes back to the time of Socrates. That goes back to the time of the Greeks. The founder of, in many ways, one of the great founders of Western civilization, Plato, or his teacher Socrates, is executed by the city of Athens. Why? For being unpatriotic, essentially. So there's always been, and I could give many other examples of this from ancient literature as well as from more modern times. Patriotism has always been, in some ways, a contested virtue. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it cannot be, we cannot afford to reject it, to reject, to reject it. It is a virtue. It is a virtue.
And I should probably acknowledge that, I mean, there 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 are many who reject patriotism for some sincerely held deep beliefs, in some cases religious beliefs. You don't see the American flag on Amish buggies, for instance, but for an extreme example. But yeah, we should just probably acknowledge that that there are some very sincere reasons that people
Sure.
hold, and in a democracy, in a pluralistic society, that's everyone has the freedom to do that. That's one of the great things about it, right?
Right. I mean, patriotism and religion have always, again, been. They've not always. It has not always been an easy relationship with the two. I'll just give you an example. One of the foundational texts of Western Christianity, which I teach every year at a program here at Yale. It's probably known to all your listeners, even if they don't necessarily read it, is St. Augustine's The City of God.
Mm.
And the City of God is in many ways a harsh critique of the values or virtues of the Roman citizen. And it tells us that the Christian's true home is not here. It is not in this world. It's in the other world. We are, as Augustine said, we are pilgrims in this life. Don't think of yourself as a citizen. We're pilgrims walking through. We have an obligation to obey the laws and so on under the society in which we live. But the idea of patriotism as a virtue would not have been high on Augustine's list. And when you look also at secular political theorists later on, I'll take one maybe controversial example, one of my one of my favorite political theorists, Machiavelli.
Mm.
Machiavelli blamed Christianity for the decline of republics. Why were there no longer free republics in the modern world, in his modern world, his world in the 16th century? It had a lot to do with the otherworldliness of Christianity. Christians looked at the other world. They didn't pay enough attention to they thought what was going on here was a veil of tears. It didn't matter that much. But they lost the sense of patriotism. And Machiavelli said in a famous letter he wrote, he said, "I love my country more than my soul." I mean, a remarkable statement. And so uh, those are extreme views, to be sure. I mean, there are ways of reconciling religious belief with patriotism, absolutely. But I just wanted to point out that they have also, Christianity and religion generally, Judaism, have often had a difficult time with patriotism. If I can use just one other example, which I
Yeah.
like, during the Civil War, because you mentioned the Amish, Lincoln in the White House had a delegation from the Quaker community. And the Quakers were anti slavery, but they were also anti war.
Hmm.
And they came to address, he gave this group an audience and listened to them. And he wrote a very moving letter to the head of the delegation, a lady, Mrs. Eliza Gurney, telling her that he completely understood and sympathized with this conflict of loyalties, as it were. You know, their religion says one thing, their political leanings said something else, and he says, some of you will go to one side and some will go to the other. And he said, I will do the best I can to accommodate those of the Quaker faith. So, you know, you can see that's another example of the way in which religion and religion can complicate questions of patriotism.
So let's turn now to some of the ways that the extreme right is challenging patriotism. So what are you seeing? Well, first let's talk about what's the difference between nationalism and patriotism
Okay.
in your view?
Uh, they both derive from a kind of common root, I would say, which is a belief in the importance of the nation or the society as a basis of our uh, of our loyalties and obligations. And throughout much of the 19th century, nationalism and even the 20th century, through 19th and at least some of the 20th century, uh, nationalism was a form of emancipation. I think of Lincoln believed in the nation. You know, he uses this term to describe the American people as a nation, not a union. He says he talks of us as a nation. And of course, other great, Mazzini in Italy, of Italian nationalism, and even into the 20th century, nationalism was often seen as a movement. We often hear the term national liberation. This was in anti-colonial movements. Nationalism was a movement of liberation from colonial domination and so on. So nationalism often went hand in hand with creating a patriotic sentiment. Where it began to morph into a different direction began to take place. It's hard to ascribe it to one person or one moment, but I would say in Germany in the 20s and 30s, where German nationalism began to morph into a doctrine of us and them, friend and enemy, to use a famous legal theorist's view at the time. The world was divided into friends and enemies, though that was the primary, if not the primal, political distinction. We live in a world of enemies, and the world is defined by keeping your friends, being able to distinguish between these two. And from this point onward, nationalism began to take a militant and a kind of not just an adversarial, but a militant and aggressive tone to it, and which I think is quite different from patriotism, which is about love of country. It's about a feeling of loyalty to those in our society, a feel of kinship and fellowship among those around us. It is not about dividing the world into enemies and friends. And I think in that way, I wanted to argue nationalism becomes although it and patriotism often walked hand in hand for some time, they've taken two very different directions, and I think you see where I'm going with that.
Yeah, we've on this podcast we've done a lot of discussion about the problems on the right, the extremism on the right. We did a recent one where we've noticed this trend on the right of folks talking about so-called heritage Americans.
Yes. Well,
Some of the folks talking about this are have the title pastor, who are talking about this. And this idea that, to be a true American, it means that your heritage goes back to the founding of America, mostly talking about, Northern European descent. Italian Americans aren't included, and so, from the view of patriotism, how would a patriotic American see that sort of language and views? Um, you know,
well, one of the things, and I know that's, I mean, I guess it's widespread in certain quarters. I've heard it attributed to J.D. Vance in particular about this. But I think it is, in many ways, it is truly a corruption of American patriotism. Why do I say that? Because we are, for a very simple reason, because as your listeners know, we're getting ready to celebrate the 4th of July. And what is the 4th of July? It is it is the celebration of the, not just our independence, but the Declaration of Independence, which begins with a universalist proposition about all men being created equal, the principles of legitimate government being by consent. It's not a doctrine of heritage Americans. It's a doctrine of principle of what we stand for as a people and what we aspire to be. Our greatest reader of the Declaration of Independence, Abraham Lincoln, emphasized more than anyone the aspirational character of what it means to be an American, not just rooted in land and soil and where your ancestors came from, but to, as he says, all people of all colors everywhere, as he put it in his Dred Scott speech, are welcome to the table, so long as they subscribe to, the basic principles of freedom and democracy, et cetera, under which we live. I can't think of anything in many ways uglier at this moment than this attempt to, expel. And Lincoln dealt with this in his own time, of course. There was in which he writes about it at his time, there was the rise of what was called the American Party, as they called themselves, the Know Nothings, who were the first kind of nativist party who wanted to say that they were fearful of the influx at that time, particularly of Irish immigrants, Irish and German immigrants coming here. They weren't real Americans. They wanted, again, to tie the Declaration only to white Anglos who could, again, trace their lineage back to the time of the American founding. And Lincoln just deplored this. He found it absolutely inimical to the basic principles that he ascribed to when he read the Declaration. So, yeah, that's what I would tell our heritage Americans: read the Declaration over again and see what you think then.
so the title of your book is Reclaiming Patriotism. How do we do that? How do we reclaim it from these extremes?
Well, we have. That's a great question, and I wish I had an answer to that. It's going to be heavy lifting. It's not going to be. It won't. If it will be done, it won't be done in a day. But I think it's a matter for people, at least in my position, who are teachers, to bring these issues to the classroom. I mean, this is small potatoes. I mean, I'm not reaching masses of people, but still, I reach some, and to bring these issues, and like you, who have this mouthpiece to go in. It's one of the things I talk about near the end of the book. Patriotism isn't something we're born with. It's not implanted in our DNA. It's something that has to be taught. Uh, and we have lost the language for how to teach, again, a decent or enlightened patriotism. And it's up to all of us to do that through whether you're in a role as a teacher, whether you have so on, to bring this in, to revivify the language in which through writing, through education. It can only be done through education. You have to teach people, and maybe it's hopeless, but I I refuse to believe that. I really I can't believe that. So I'm not a religious person, but it is an article of faith in some sense with me that It is not a lost cause.
Yes, and as you mentioned, all right, so we're recording this on June 29th. This week we're celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. How are you celebrating? How are you thinking about the legacy here, and what's your week going to be like?
In fact, we will be spending our Fourth of July with the same family I mentioned earlier about when
Wow.
we get together every Fourth of July. That's what we do. Always have a little picnic out at their house with a group of friends. We'll see if the question of patriotism comes up. I might bring it up. I think I probably will bring it up and just see how people will react to it. Yeah, but I think that's, I mean, in a kind of low key way. We're not doing the usual, or anything too extravagant. We're going to staying local for it at least. But I would suggest, as we always do every year, if you're going to celebrate the Fourth, and this is a very special Fourth, wherever you're celebrating it, bring your copy of the Declaration and read it aloud. Read it, and it's very powerful when read aloud. And read it slowly. Read it carefully. I recently had the experience. I do this every summer. Uh, I teach one day in a program here at Yale called Warrior Scholars, and it's for groups of servicemen and women who are transitioning from the military and going into college. And they come to Yale for, I think it's a week, maybe it's 2 weeks over the summer. It's a kind of college boot camp. Getting ready, and they take some humanities courses and they take some STEM related courses. But I'm always asked to. We always start the first class with just a reading of the Declaration of Independence. We read it aloud, and then we just talk about. We spend 2 hours. The seminar is 2 hours. We spend 2 hours just talking about it. Many of them have never read it before. It's the first time they've been in the service, but they've never read our founding mission statement, as it were. And to me, that's one of the great teaching experiences I have every year, is reading this text slowly and then discussing it with a group of, again, military people. And I recommend to all of your listeners, that's a wonderful way. And spend 30 minutes or so doing that before you have your dinner, and you'll have a great experience. I guarantee you.
All right. And the book again, Reclaiming Patriotism in an Age of Extremes. This has been a really helpful book for me, just thinking about our work here at American Values Coalition as well. So I thank you so much for writing it. Just one more question to end on. I recently saw an organization talking about the next 250, like the next 250 years of America. My first thought was, gosh, I hope we make it to the 300th anniversary at this point. I can't even imagine like that far ahead. But just thinking from your perspective, thinking about the next 250 or the next 50 or whatever it is, what will we have done well for us to survive as a democracy?
Well, if we survive, that alone will be worth noting. Until this time in history, only the Athenian democracy in ancient times and ourselves have lasted 250 years. These are the only two democracies that have lasted this long. I appreciate the confidence of those who are looking to the next 250, but if we make it that long, that will be a record. Certainly, we're sort of at the point where it is a record for any democracy. And I always remember, I quote this in the book, but it can't be mentioned often enough, the famous statement when Benjamin Franklin was coming out of the Constitutional Convention Hall of 1787. Probably an apocryphal story. And a lady in Philadelphia says to him, "Well, Mr. Franklin, what do we have? A monarchy or a republic?" And Benjamin Franklin said to her, "A republic if you can keep it." And that will be the challenge for the next 250 years, or even for the next 5 years, if we can keep it. A big if. Yeah.
Stephen Smith, thank you so much for joining the ABC podcast.
Nap, it was my pleasure.